Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Honorable Chairperson of this Honorable Chairperson Professor Latif Kazmi Sahab, Department of Philosophy, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh, the coordinator of the Hikmat Society, and Professor Abdul Majid Khan Sahab, and all the respected persons and dear students who have joined this program. I am indeed very happy that the students of the Department of Philosophy of Aligarh Muslim University have set up the Hikmat Society for taking up Islamic traditional philosophy as a living philosophy, for the purpose of dialogue of this philosophy with other disciplines, as well as with the other traditional philosophies as sister philosophies, and of course with the modern Western positivist philosophy, which is the reigning philosophy. So it is a very welcome and very valuable step, and I hope that it will continue to work for its aims. At the outset, I wish to thank Professor Latif Kazmi and Professor Abdul Majid Khan for joining this program in the capacity of the chairperson and in the capacity of one of the speakers. These are very senior and eminent scholars who have given fillip to this valuable step of setting up of the Hikmat Society. Now coming to the topic on which I will be submitting certain views. As I think you can see on the screen, it is traditional philosophy as operative and optimizing universal philosophy, with special reference to Islamic philosophy. Now, as it has been pointed out by the coordinator of the Hikmat Society and by respected Professor Abdul Majid Khan Sahab, there is traditional philosophy needs to be brought up in mainstream academic institutions as a living philosophy in order to analyze the existing learning, the various sciences and disciplines, both human sciences as well as natural sciences, and so that proper guidance may be given to this learning by means of traditional philosophy. Unfortunately, for a long time, philosophy, which is otherwise called the mother of sciences, has not played this role of guiding various disciplines, and the impasses and dead ends which have emerged in various disciplines are mainly due to this fact, that they are not being guided by philosophy. Now, this is not very surprising, because the dominant philosophy, which is the modern Western positivist philosophy, is basically an epiphenomenon of the empirical sciences. It is something which is derived from the empirical sciences rather than an independent discipline, having data of its own, having methods of its own, and then providing the principles to the various sciences. So instead of being an independent science, having an independent discipline, having its own data and method, modern Western philosophy is nothing but a paraphrasing of the empirical sciences. So it is no wonder that these sciences, the modern Western sciences, whether natural or human, have stopped receiving guidance from philosophy. And it is here that traditional philosophy, which is an independent discipline, which is an independent philosophy with the data of its own, with the method of its own, and in a position to give principles to various modern sciences, both natural and human, it should come up. Traditional philosophy should come up as an operative philosophy and optimizing philosophy. Optimizing in the sense of analyzing the existing sciences, both human and natural, and then providing the guidance for the improvement in these sciences. So this is the basic and apical step which has to be taken of reviving traditional philosophy as a universal, operative, and optimizing philosophy. Now, once the rationale of reviving traditional philosophy has been stated, we can come to traditional philosophy itself. Traditional philosophy, in the light of whatever has been already said, has to be approached as a universal philosophy and as a living philosophy. Universal means inclusive, a philosophy whose terms and concerns and methods can be shared by all civilizations of humanity. So universal in that sense. Traditional philosophy, the history of traditional philosophy bears it out that traditional philosophy is indeed a universal philosophy. There's a quotation by Hauser, a scholar working in the University of St. Thomas in Houston. So he mentions, Hauser mentions that Aquinas, that is Thomas Aquinas, is best understood as an Avicennian kind of Aristotelian. Everyone, most of us are aware that Thomas Aquinas was basically an Aristotelian thinker and a scholar who had wedded Aristotelian philosophy to Christian theology. But Hauser has pointed out that he was an Avicennian kind of Aristotelian scholar. So this brings out the fact that traditional philosophy is a universal philosophy, whether it is being developed in the Islamic civilization by Avicenna or it is being developed in the Christian civilization by Thomas Aquinas, or it is being developed by Shankar in the Hindu civilization, or being developed by other scholars in the Far Eastern civilization. So all these traditional philosophies, they are universal in the sense of having the same common ground, ideas, schemes, issues, concerns, and methods. Then traditional philosophy has also to be approached as a living philosophy, not only as a thing which is dead and past and which has to be studied for historical interest, but rather as a living philosophy. And the recent experience with the FICA F, which has already been introduced, FICA F stands for FICA follow-up, the continuing chain of scholarly and academic activity, which started as a follow-up of the pioneering workshop by the name of FICA, held in AMU in 2015. So this FICA follow-up, it has been witnessed to the fact that traditional philosophy, mainly with reference to Islamic traditional philosophy, has been applied to very diverse disciplines like epistemology, medicine, psychology, law, literary theory and literary criticism, quantum literary criticism, etc. And it has given an excellent analysis of these subjects and pointed out the way of improvement of these subjects. So the experience with FICA follow-up, as well as other kindred experience, such as the book on quantum mechanics by Wolfgang Smith, they amply show that traditional philosophy is a living philosophy which is continuing to guide modern philosophy, modern psychology, modern medicine, modern law, modern literary theory and literary criticism, modern physics, etc. So once we have noted that, first of all, we noted that traditional philosophy will start, the revival of traditional philosophy will restart the role of philosophy as the mother of sciences and give direction and guidance to the existing learning, and which will be instrumental and pivotal in salvaging them and pulling them out of the impasses and dead ends which they are suffering because of the inability of Western positivist philosophy to guide all the disciplines. So this task has to be now taken up by traditional philosophy, and then we have seen that the traditional philosophy, there is ample evidence for the fact that traditional philosophy is a universal philosophy in the sense of having ideas and schemes and methods which can be followed and understood and accepted by all civilizations, and it is a living philosophy in the sense that it is able to make very good sense out of the modern sciences, both human as well as natural, and by pointing out the areas which are problematic and pointing out the objectives for which these sciences should work in order to improve themselves and come out of the problem, come out of the impasses and dead ends with which contemporary learning is suffering. And in fact, the multifaceted crises besetting humanity are mainly due to the impasses in learning, and these impasses and dead ends in learning can be solved by traditional philosophy. This has been amply shown by the experience in FICA follow-up, where traditional philosophy was fruitfully applied to modern sciences with very interesting, exciting, and creative and new findings. And this has been done in other areas of the world also, such as the book on quantum mechanics by Wolfgang Smith. So now we can take the next step of classifying the philosophy, and we reach the very surprising and very intriguing understanding that the philosophies of the world, they can all be classified into basically two groups. One of the group is modern Western positivist philosophy, and the other group is the traditional philosophies. And the distinction of modern Western positivist philosophy, that it is a senses only philosophy which depends only on data obtained by the empirical sciences, whereas traditional philosophies, they take their data from the senses, but also from reason, intuition, and even from revelation. And naturally, then their ontology is also very inclusive. They address the material level as well as the supramaterial level. So this is the basic distinction between modern Western positivist philosophy, that it is based only upon sensory data, whereas traditional philosophies are based upon sensory data as well as data obtained from reason, intuition, revelation, etc. So we can say that traditional philosophies, if they were to be described by one adjective, one ruling adjective, we could say that the traditional philosophies are comprehensive. They are a comprehensive philosophy, or they are all-inclusive philosophy. All-inclusive in the sense of addressing all levels of reality, material and supramaterial, and all-inclusive in the sense of using all levels of consciousness, senses, reason, intuition, revelation, etc. So now I hope that we have a good comparative understanding of the philosophies of the world to be divided into two groups: the positivist philosophy and the traditional philosophies. Positivist philosophies being senses only philosophy, and traditional philosophy being philosophy based upon senses, reason, intuition, and revelation. Now this immediately makes it very clear to a person of even average discernment that the traditional philosophies have their own data and they have their own method, whereas a positivist philosophy is just a paraphrasing of the modern empirical sciences. So as it was said in the introduction, because it is itself a paraphrasing of empirical sciences, it is not in any position to give independent guidance to the modern sciences, whether empirical or human, whereas traditional philosophy, as we have seen, by means of this classification and by means of the epistemology of traditional philosophy, which is all-inclusive, traditional philosophy has got its own data and method, so it is really in a position to play the role of mother of sciences by giving guidance and principles to various disciplines, and both human sciences as well as natural sciences, and improving them. Now once we bring up this matter that present day learning is not being guided by even the modern Western positivist philosophy, then a very pertinent question is, then what is what or who is the guide of contemporary learning? So then we'll reach a very interesting conclusion and very surprising conclusion, that contemporary learning is being guided by populist assertions rather than by intellectually deep and sober systems of thought. Instead of that, contemporary learning is being guided by populist assertions, and if traditional philosophy is revived, then contemporary learning will have a truly intellectual guidance rather than merely populist assertions of a Dawkins or a Hawkins or some other persons of that type. So once we have understood the case of the need of reviving traditional philosophy as a means of improving present day learning, both natural sciences and human sciences, then the next step is that among the traditional philosophies, Islamic philosophy is also a traditional philosophy, and it has certain unique distinctions vis-a-vis other traditional philosophies, although it shares the basic ground with all the traditional philosophies. But despite sharing the basic ground with all traditional philosophies, having the same ideas, the same schemes, the same objectives, the same methodology, it has some significant distinctions also. One of the distinction of Islamic traditional philosophy is that it is the most universal traditional philosophy. Now, this is attested beautifully too by a statement by Ananda Kumaraswamy, the foremost metaphysician of the 20th century, and basically a a scholar of Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. So Ananda Kumaraswamy in his selected letters mentions that Islam mediates both Eastern and Western approach. Neoplatonic philosophy is in a sense proto-Western, ancient Greek philosophy is in a sense proto-Western, and then of course the philosophy of the Renaissance, the philosophy of the Enlightenment, and the modern positivist philosophy. All these philosophies, they are unified by a particular approach which can be called the Western approach. On the other hand, Hindu philosophy and Buddhist philosophy and Taoist philosophy, it has got another, they have got another format and structure which can be called Eastern approach. So Kumaraswamy points out that Islam mediates between both the Eastern and Western approach. It has within itself both these dimensions. So this shows very clearly that among the traditional philosophies, despite sharing their basic ground, Islamic philosophy is the most universal traditional philosophy. It has the Eastern approach of Hindu, Buddhist, and Taoist philosophy, as well as the Western approach of ancient Greek philosophy, Neoplatonic philosophy, and of course now the present day modern Western positivist philosophy. So it mediates both the Eastern and Western approach. That's why Islamic traditional philosophy was not restricted to the Islamic civilization. It was not restricted to leading and guiding learning within the Islamic civilization. Rather, it had a global appeal, and it was, for instance, the foremost Christian scholastic philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas has been called by Hauser as an Avicennian kind of Aristotelian scholar. So Islamic, as it is common knowledge, that Avicenna is one of the foremost traditional Islamic philosophers. So his philosophy was very matter-of-factly and very spontaneously imbibed by Thomas Aquinas, to the extent that the entire approach of Thomas Aquinas has been called Avicennian by Hauser, a scholar working in the University of St. Thomas. This shows that the Islamic tradition philosophy, because it mediates both the Eastern and Western approach, so it is kindred, it is acceptable, it is understandable, and it is useful and usable by a Christian civilization as well as by Hindu civilization, as it has been pointed out by Tarachand in his classic Influence of Islam on Indian Culture. The development of Advaita Vedanta by Shankar, one of the influences behind it was Islam. So Islam and Islamic philosophy on the one hand was taken up by a Christian theologian, and on the other hand it was taken up, it catalyzed the thinking and mind of a great Hindu, or we can say the foremost Hindu philosopher, Shankar. His mind was also catalyzed and directed so that it played a role in leading his mind to his well-known Advaita Vedanta philosophy. The other distinction which Islamic traditional philosophy has, even vis-a-vis the other traditional philosophies, despite sharing the common ground, is that it is the most comprehensive and coherent traditional philosophy. Its ontology and epistemology is most coherent. the epistemology of Islamic philosophy, one of the very basic influences on the epistemology of Islamic philosophy can be traced to the Quranic ayat of Quranic ayat in Surah Bani Israel, which says that A'udhu billahi minash shaitani rajim, in La taqfu ma laysa laka bihi ilm, inna as-sam'a wal basara wal fu'ada kullu ulaika kana anhu mas'ula. Now in this ayat, I will not go into a detailed translation and analysis of this ayat. I will just restrict myself to aspects which are relevant to the current discussion. Basar, that is vision, and sama, that is hearing, and fuad, that is the intellect. They are shown to be the means of knowledge, the means of knowing the truth. So among the heavenly books, Quran is very overt in accepting along with the intellect or spiritual intuition and reason and divine revelation. Along with these means of knowledge and truth, the Quran also talks of basar or sensory observations, the use of the senses. So this is a very overt acceptance of sensory observations as one of the means of knowledge. But of course, pride of place is given to fuad or the intellect, which on the one hand is the vehicle, is the means of intellectual intuition of a sage, and on the other hand, it is the seat which receives the divine revelation in case of prophet. So of course it gives pride of place to fuad, but along with fuad it also speaks of basar, that is vision. So the epistemology of Islamic philosophy came about to be very comprehensive because of such powerful influences of the Quran, which gave a very positive, which has a very comprehensive vision of epistemology, where of course there is fuad or the intellect, which is responsible for receiving revelation in the prophet and which is also responsible for giving spiritual intuition to sages. So along with that, there is the recognition of basar or vision or the five external senses as means of truth, but of course certain levels of truth as means of knowing the truth, they are also accepted. So it is powerful visions like this which gave to Islamic philosophy its very comprehensive epistemology. So this is on the one hand, Islamic philosophy is one of the most universal traditional philosophies because it mediates both the Eastern and Western approach. The approach used by Hindu, Buddhist and Taoist philosophy on the one hand, and the approach used by ancient Greek, Neoplatonic and modern Western philosophy on the other hand. So it is most universal, and at the same time it is most comprehensive and very significantly very coherent. So much so that in 1948, after India became free, after independence of India, a very seminal committee called as the Chopra Committee was set up to chalk out the path for development of Indian systems of medicine like Ayurveda, Siddha, Unani medicine, Tibetan medicine. So this Chopra Committee, it came out with the recommendation that Unani principles should be taught even to students of Ayurveda, because Unani medicine is very systematic and coherent, and so Unani principles can be used as keys for understanding the relatively complex Ayurveda. So this comprehensiveness and coherence is yet another distinctions of Islamic philosophy. Yet another distinction is that the Islamic philosophy is tuned both to the ancient mind and the contemporary mind. It is tuned to both the ancient mind as well as the contemporary mind. As it has been pointed out by Guénon, the universal principle is responsible for intellection and spiritual intuition, and the individual principle is responsible for external observations and reason and mathematics. And he has pointed out that with time the universal principle is declining and the individual principle is increasing. So the universal mentality was more focused on revelation and intuition, and the contemporary mentality is more focused on observation, reason, etc. Islamic philosophy in a sense mediates between the ancient and the contemporary also. Just as it mediates between the East and West, it also, in the temporal perspective, it mediates between the ancient and the contemporary by giving equal importance to revelation, intuition, as well as to observation, reason, and mathematics. And in this also it found its food and energy from Islamic scriptures. And Islamic scriptures have one of the unique features of Islamic scriptures in terms of the universal and the individual is that on the one hand they attempt to preserve the universal, which characterizes the ancient mind, to the maximum possible extent without creating mashaqqat or difficulty for the contemporary man. And on the other hand, Islamic scriptures give extra space, the minimum necessary extra space for the individual element which characterizes the contemporary mind. So in this way, this is yet another distinction of Islamic philosophy, that it is tuned to both the ancient mentality as well as the contemporary mentality. And as a result, Islamic traditional medicine is a traditional philosophy which is most relatable to contemporary phenomena and ideas. And as mentioned earlier, this one forceful evidence of this fact is that in the last few years, since 2015, the academic and scholarly events which were undertaken under FICA follow-up, their traditional philosophy was used very fruitfully, and traditional philosophy with a special reference to Islamic traditional philosophy was found to be very fruitful when being applied to modern psychology, law, medicine, and literature, etc. So the distinction of Islamic traditional philosophy, that it is tuned both to the ancient and contemporary mentality, is borne out by the fact that it is able to it can be easily applied by people of average intelligence to contemporary learning, to contemporary phenomena, and with fruitful results, with new knowledge, and with very exciting knowledge, which has got the potential for further improving the modern disciplines. So these are some of the distinctions which Islamic traditional philosophy has within the traditional philosophies, while fully sharing the common ground, the common ideas, the common objectives, and the common method that is addressing all levels of reality and using all levels of consciousness. So despite sharing this very fundamental ground with all traditional philosophies, it has its own distinctions, and it is most universal, mediates between the Eastern and Western approach, and it is most comprehensive. It mediates between the ancient mentality and contemporary mentality. So it is able to relate the most fundamental and intellective principles to present day learning and present day sciences. It is able to relate the two quite effectively, which has been seen in the events held under FICA follow-up, when traditional philosophy, particularly with reference to Islamic traditional philosophy, was applied to psychology, law, medicine, literary theory and literary criticism, etc., with very good new and novel results, which were widely appreciated by people belonging to these disciplines. So now we take the next step. Right from the beginning, we have seen that traditional philosophy needs to be revived as a living or operational philosophy. And because traditional philosophy is an independent discipline, and which has got the ability to guide other disciplines rather than being a paraphrase, just being a paraphrase of the empirical sciences. So instead of that, it is an independent discipline which is fundamental to all other sciences. So it has got the ability to guide contemporary learning and solve the impasses and dead ends which have emerged in all areas of contemporary learning, and which are behind the pervasive practical crises with which we are suffering, extending from global warming to breakdown of the family, etc., etc. So the focus is on studying traditional philosophy as a living or operational philosophy. Only that would bring out the true value of traditional philosophy, if it is taken up as a living or operational philosophy. So now we raise the question, what are the steps which are needed for making traditional philosophy, or for ensuring that traditional philosophy is used as a living philosophy or as an operational philosophy? What are the steps which have to be taken? So the first and most fundamental step is that traditional philosophy should be restated in a contemporary idiom. It does not need to be basically changed. Its entire beauty, worth and value is in its distinctive character of relating revelation and intuition to senses. So that no change is needed, but a restatement is definitely needed, so that it may become comprehensible to the contemporary mind and contemporary mentality on the one hand, and it becomes easy to relate it to contemporary phenomena and contemporary ideas. So the foremost step which is needed for using traditional philosophy as a living or operational philosophy is the restatement of traditional philosophy in contemporary idioms, which will make it easily comprehensible to contemporary mentality. And of course, this will lead, and the next step is engagement with contemporary phenomena, ideas, and even with the modern Western positivist philosophy. So restatement and engagement, these are the twin steps which need to be taken to use traditional philosophy as a living philosophy. Now the first of these, that is the restatement in a contemporary idiom, this has been remarkably and authentically done with reference to Islamic traditional philosophy. And in this task, Sayyid Hussain Nasr has done yeoman's service, and single-handedly he has restated a vast corpus of traditional Islamic philosophy in contemporary understandable terms, so much so that more than in the Muslim world or more than in the East, he is revered and accepted and benefited from in the West as a scholar of philosophy, particularly Islamic philosophy. So the restatement in contemporary idiom has been to a great extent accomplished, and in this a very gigantic role has been played by Sayyid Hussain Nasr, but of course there are other persons also like Sayyid Naqib al-Attas, Martin Links, Titus Buchart, Houston Smith, and of course the great venerated Ananda Kumaraswamy. So these are also persons who have restated traditional philosophy. Anand Kumaraswamy has restated Hindu and Buddhist traditional philosophy, but Islamic traditional philosophy has been quite widely and nearly completely restated and authentically restated in contemporary idiom by Sayyid Hussain Nasr, Al-Attas, Links, Buchart, etc. Quite surprisingly, this ringing success has not been achieved in the restatement of other traditional philosophies. For instance, in the case of Hindu traditional philosophy, again the foremost exponent of Hindu traditional philosophy, that is Ananda Kumaraswamy, has pointed out that Radha Krishnan, who is otherwise considered to be a very good exponent of Hindu philosophy, Hindu traditional philosophy stated in contemporary terms, Ananda Kumaraswamy says that Radha Krishnan had failed in this task. In fact, Radha Krishnan had wittingly and unwittingly, consciously and unconsciously molded Hindu traditional philosophy to the Western mind. So what Radha Krishnan presented, although his intention was to restate Hindu traditional philosophy in contemporary terms, just like Nasr's aim is to restate Islamic traditional philosophy in contemporary terms, but whereas Nasr succeeded in presenting authentic and true Islamic traditional philosophy in contemporary terms, Radha Krishnan ended up in distorting Hindu traditional philosophy and molding it to Western thought patterns in the attempt to present it in a contemporary idiom to contemporary mentality. So again, we have this very interesting realization that traditional Islamic philosophy, on the one hand, it enjoys certain distinctions. Despite sharing common ground with all traditional philosophies, it has certain distinctions which we have discussed, and I don't want to go into them again. At the same time, Islamic traditional philosophy has been most completely and most authentically restated in contemporary idiom, which, as we have seen, is the first step in studying and using traditional philosophy as a living philosophy. So the ground is set for the use of, it is particularly set for the use of Islamic traditional philosophy as a living philosophy. Other traditional philosophies have also been to a great extent expressed in contemporary terms, but this has not been so complete and comprehensive and sufficient as in the case of Islamic traditional philosophy. So traditional philosophy, because to some extent all traditional philosophies have been restated, they can be used as living philosophies, but Islamic traditional philosophy has the greatest potential of being used as a living traditional philosophy in the contemporary times for the purpose of analyzing and guiding and optimizing the existing learning both in the natural sciences and the human sciences. Now I come to the penultimate step in my submission, and this is about the hallmarks of traditional philosophy. We have already seen how traditional philosophy is unique and different from the existing modern Western positivist philosophy, in that traditional philosophy addresses all levels of reality, both material and supramaterial, and it uses all levels of consciousness, that is the senses, then reason, and then spiritual intuition and even revelation. So it is in this respect that traditional philosophy is distinct from positivist philosophy, which is a senses only philosophy. But in addition to these differences in the object of study, in being all levels of being, and the method of study in utilizing all levels of consciousness, in addition to these two very fundamental distinctions of all traditional philosophies from positivist philosophy, modern was Western positivist philosophy, there are 2 or 3 other important differences also. One of the difference is the acceptance of immediate knowledge, which is called ilm huzuri in traditional Islamic philosophy, which becomes clear to human beings immediately, without any need of logic or reason or empirical study. It is self-evident. So this is a feature of all traditional philosophies, and especially so of Islamic traditional philosophy. That is, these traditional philosophies, particularly Islamic traditional philosophy, accept both ilm husuli or acquired knowledge, which is acquired by reason or by mathematics or by empirical observation. But along with ilm husuli or acquired knowledge, they also accept ilm huzuri or self-evident knowledge, which is self-evident to the maybe not to the average person, but to the highest sages. So this is yet another distinction, and this is what makes traditional medicine really powerful and independent disciplines, that they start with ilm huzuri, they start with immediate knowledge, which do not need any confirmation by reason or mathematics, or because they are self-evident truths. Modern Western positivist philosophy, by comparison, have got no such axioms, because axiom is a self-evident truth. So in modern Western positivist philosophy, there are no axioms. That is why modern Western positivist philosophy is very weak, and it is just a paraphrasing of the empirical sciences, because it does not have self-evident axioms and basic truths at its disposal, but which are there. So this acceptance of ilm huzuri along with ilm husuli is yet another fundamental distinction between positivist philosophy and traditional philosophies in general, and Islamic traditional philosophy in particular. And the last thing which I want to mention on this occasion, there are many distinctions, but in the limited scope of today's talk, I can talk of only one more fundamental distinction, and this is that traditional philosophy studies both the essence of an object as well as the contingent or surface qualities of the object. Whereas modern Western positivist philosophy studies only the contingent or surface characters of the object. It does not study the essence of the object. So this is yet another very, very important and significant difference between traditional philosophy in general and Islamic traditional philosophy in particular, and the Western modern Western positivist philosophy, that Islamic traditional philosophy studies both essence and contingence, whereas Western philosophy or learning studies only the contingents or surface characters. Now, by virtue of studying essence, Islamic traditional philosophy is able to aim at and find out the immutable truth of an object, the immutable truth, the unchanging truth of an object, because essence is unchanging. And it is able to develop metaphysics, because true metaphysics is an immutable science which is timeless, which does not change with time, rather which makes various phases of time comprehensible by its ideas and by its schemes. So by aiming at essence, traditional philosophy in general and Islamic traditional philosophy in particular is able to find out the immutable truth of an object, and which are then put together to create a true metaphysics, as well as space-time facts and science, what we understand as science. So it is able to have a space and ground for space-time qualities or characters of objects, along with, of course, the timeless essence, the space-time related facts. And this translates the study of these aspects, of the contingent aspect of objects, this translates as science. So traditional philosophy, and particularly Islamic traditional philosophy, aims at both essence, and thereby it possesses immutable truths and true metaphysics, and it also aims at space-time characters of objects, by virtue of which it is able to lay ground for very strong sciences like the traditional medicine of Islamic civilization, which is known as Unani medicine. So these are some of the hallmarks of traditional philosophy, because we must have the criteria of traditional philosophy. Only then we can develop a true and genuine traditional philosophy. So these are the differences, these are the important differences between traditional philosophies in general and Islamic traditional philosophy in particular on one hand, and modern Western positivist philosophy. That is, the objectives include both the material and supramaterial level. The methods include both the senses as well as spiritual intuition and revelation, and both self-evident knowledge as well as knowledge acquired by logic or by empirical observation. Both types of knowledge are accepted. And fourthly and lastly, the immutable truth of an object, or the essence or the mahiyat of an object, is also studied, and thus it has a true metaphysics which is timeless. But at the same time, the space-time related characters which change with the space and time of the same object, the space-time related characters of the same object are also accepted, and an epistemology is developed for studying them also, and thus it is able to develop sciences also which study the same objects but at the level of contingence, and thus they come up as sciences which have got mainly practical utility, whereas metaphysics has got mainly intellectual utility. So now I come to of course, the last step, and this is about sources. Unfortunately, the existing academic sources, I will not recount the name of the basic sources of Islamic traditional philosophy in universities and colleges, but what can be said in general about these sources, existing academic sources which are part of the syllabi in most of the universities, part of the syllabi on Islamic traditional philosophy in most of the universities and colleges? They are very problematic, and they are problematic because in these sources Islamic philosophy has been studied in the perspective of positivist philosophy. And as we have seen, positivist philosophy is a very narrow philosophy. So a very big part of Islamic philosophy is left out, or it is wrongly interpreted. So unfortunately, the existing academic sources in most universities and colleges for traditional philosophy in general and Islamic traditional philosophy in particular, they are problematic. They are not very helpful. because they include a study of Islamic philosophy in the positivist perspective, because of which Islamic philosophy has been greatly reduced and even distorted. But fortunately, due to the very hard work of great and inspired and very powerful scholars in the 20th century and 19th century, now we have authentic sources also. Again, I'll mention Sayyid Hussain Nasr, and I'll especially mention two of his books, Islamic Philosophy from the Origin to the Present, and the other one being Islam in the Modern World. There are a very large number of other very valuable books by S.H. Nasr, which you can find in most of the databases and even on the website of fikaf.com. Then there is Al-Attas, his Prolegomena to Islamic Metaphysics is a good source. Then of course in the pre-modern phase we have in the traditional trajectory, this is in the modern trajectory, but in the traditional trajectory we have Ashraf Ali Thanvi, we have Qasim Nanotvi, and in a slightly pre-modern period we have Shah Waliullah. Shah Waliullah's Hujjatullah al-Baligha, Ashraf Ali Thanvi's Al-Intibahat al-Mufida, Qasim Nanotvi's Taqreer Dil-Pazir. These are some traditional and pre-modern sources of traditional Islamic philosophy. And then there is a very delightful and very useful source, which is a history of Islamic philosophy edited by Lehman and Nasr. Then on the traditional, purely traditional side, because Islamic traditional philosophy is of course a traditional philosophy, so it is being studied, continuously being studied as a living philosophy in the madrasas, in the Islamic traditional academic institutions. And here again we should note that this is a very interesting fact, that just as Islamic traditional philosophy has got some unique distinctions, it is one of the most powerful traditional philosophy, and just as Islamic traditional philosophy has been most successfully restated in complementary idiom, in the same way Islamic civilization enjoys the unique distinction of a huge number of traditional academic institutions, otherwise known as madrasas, which is unfortunately not the case in other civilizations. So this is again a distinction, that the Islamic civilization has got a very huge number of traditional academic institutions. So they have their own sources for studying Islamic traditional philosophy, from which the universities and colleges should also benefit. For instance, Sharh-e-Hidayah Hikmat by Mebzi, and Shah Waliullah's Hujjatullah al-Baligha, then Qasim Nanotvi's Taqreer Dil-Pazir, Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi's Al-Intibahat al-Mufida, and then Saeed Palanpuri's Muinul Falsafa in Urdu, and the English translation of Thanvi's Intibahatul Mufida by Hassan Askari, known as Answer to Modernism. And then the other ones are Amuzish Falsafa, which is a book in Persian, which is the basic book on philosophy in most of the Iranian madrasas. Amuzish Falsafa. Then Usul Falsafa wa Ravish Realism by Allama Tabatabai. Then Baqir Sadr's Falsfatuna, and then Hairi Yazdi's Ilm-e Huzuri, and a bedrock is provided of fundamental metaphysics, of Islamic traditional philosophy is provided by many books by Guénon, Schuon, Links, Bughart, Kumaraswamy, Houston Smith, etc. I will mention only one book by Guénon. I have time to mention only one book by Guénon, that is Introduction to Oriental Doctrines. So these are some of the authentic sources spanning from Sayyid Hussain Nasr to and with this I end, and by expressing my wishes and prayers for the success and continuity of the Hikmat Society, and expressing my gratitude to Professor Kazmi and to Professor Abdul Majid Khan Sahab for encouraging the students of the philosophy department of AMU to start this Hikmat Society. Thank you very much.